Hello and good evening. My name is Lee Ullman and I'm the director of the MIT Sloan Latin America office. This office is based in Santiago de Chile, but currently we're virtual for the last couple of months since March. I hope that everyone is well on this Monday and that you are healthy. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Luis Perez-Breva, a good friend of Latin America. Luis was here in Chile a couple of years back for the MIT GSW. Luis is also one of the major players at MIT in the innovation world. Luis happens to be the director of the MIT Innovation Teams program. As many of you are aware, Luis is currently doing an online innovation program in Spanish. And tonight, Luis was asking us if he could do this in Spanish, but we asked him to actually do it in English. Lo siento. And the reason is that for all of our friends from Brazil who will be joining us, my Portuguese is weak to non-existent and I don't know Luis's, and thus we figured English would be the most neutral language. So again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. And before I turn over the mic to Luis, I'd like to give you a little bit of the ground rules. So on the bottom of the Zoom, you'll see something that says Q&A. To make this as interactive as possible, we'd like you to ask questions. We'd like you to be involved, and you're able to upvote the questions that you like. And this will give us the ability to ask Luis the most pertinent questions based on the audience's interest. You're also able to use the chat, but we prefer you put your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat. Other than that, please enjoy. I'm sure Luis is looking forward to speaking with all of you. And I will be back later to moderate the chat between the audience and Luis. So more than anything, thank you, Luis, and thank you, Jacqueline Taylor, for helping us out with this and for making this all work. So Luis, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks, Lee. And thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, MIT Management Latin America office for having me here. And thank you all of you for showing up today. So this is going to be funny because I can't see anybody and I'm very used to seeing people while I'm giving presentations. So I guess as Lee put it, we're going to try to give you enough content, enough provocative content for you guys to have lots of questions at the end of this. And so we can have a conversation. That's the plan. So I'm going to do is I'm going to share some slides so you'll see me and some slides and we can get going. So let's see if I can make this work. And see on. So are my slides visible? Lee, can you help me out here for a second?
You're all good. Looks great.
Perfect. So let's get started. So why are we doing this? Why are we talking today about innovating without hangups? Why is it that we've been going at this with a number of webinars over the last few months? Well, we all know, we all wanted innovation, we all wanted disruption, we all wanted exponential growth, and then we got it. We got it from a virus. And now it turns out that a lot of what we've been hearing about innovation over the last 2 decades turns out to not be that useful anymore. Why? Well, it's not that it was a bad idea. It's just like it was all great for a world in which we were all bountiful, right? And that's not the world we live in today. Today, it's a world in which we need to learn how to go forward with what we have and sort of solve problems that really matter. And so we've been trying really hard to put as much content out there as we can to help all of you guys figure out what to do next. And so this presentation is about that. So I'm going to give you a few cues for how to think through this period, for how to think about the conversation we'll have later on. And before I do that, I need to tell you just 2 cents about me, which is, why is it that I'm doing this? So if you've been following my work, you know I do 2 things. I obsess about innovating and I obsess about artificial intelligence. Why is it that I care about these 2 things? Well, since as far as I can remember, there is one thing that bugs me, which is, how do we define problems that matter so that computers can help us solve it? And how is it that we get technology to use that? So essentially, my problem is that I have 2 ideas, 2 big ideas. How do we get problems that matter? Those should be possibly helped by technology. And somehow the connection between those 2 things is not ready-made. You don't get lists of technologies. You don't get lists of problems and then simply do matchmaking. So about 12 years ago, we started an experiment at MIT, which is this class called iTeams, where we try to answer that question. And so for the last 12 years, we've been trying to learn how to answer that question. We take technologies and we try to figure out which problems we can solve and how do we define problems. And so it could not have worked. It did work. And so what you see in the screens now is sort of the fact sheet of our program. About 200 technologies we've looked at. About 20% of these technologies find a way to solve a problem, but perhaps the most interesting statistic, at least to me, what fills me with pride, is that about 90% of those technologies that choose to go out and solve a problem actually solve the problem. So we came up with something and said, wait, might this only work at MIT? Maybe. So we've tried it, and for the last 2 decades, 1 decade, we've actually tried these all over the world. We've tried it with venture capital, with corporations, in academia, until I realized we had set up almost about 30 innovating factories. And I'll tell you what that thing of an innovating factory is at the end of this presentation. So we wrapped it up, and I said, you know what? Actually, I didn't say that. Charlie Cooney, fellow faculty from MIT, told me I should write a book, and so I wrote a book. And I wrote the book, and I tried with that book to do something that's unusual in academia. I tried to write it, of course, with peer review, but also make it highly accessible. And that turns out to be very, very useful nowadays for what I want to tell you about. So know that if you like the stories you're going to hear about today, you can get them in the book, you can get them in a bunch of places. And I'll tell you about that in a second. Now that you have this introduction about why this guy that did artificial intelligence got to do innovating and got to write a book and all these things, let me tell you about what I would like to share with you today. So this is the idea, 3 ideas. First of all, what does innovating mean today in this world? Not in the world where you could actually afford releasing a minimum viable product, or you could dream about disruption. No, in this world. So what we've discovered is that we need a new language. Disruption, exponential progression, lean startups no longer means the same thing anymore ever since we got this pandemic. We're going to discuss that new language, and I'm going to tell you that it turns out you can actually start with what you have. And that's great news because that's probably the only thing you have today. I was joking with my kids this morning that Amazon is no longer 2-day delivery. So you need to start thinking about how is it that you move forward with what you have. Fortunately for us, this is exactly the way we've been teaching innovating for the last 2 decades. So we want to share that with you. How do you repurpose? How do you reuse? And how do you turn this into a reliable process? And ultimately, as you move forward, as we move from this pandemic to whatever comes next, it might be worth to think of this as a process you follow continuously. And so we're going to discuss at the end a few ideas about how to innovate continually and how to make it your competitive advantage to innovate continuously and to solve problems that matter. So that's what I want to talk about today. If after today we only have about an hour, you like what you see, you like what you hear, this is what's going to happen next. There's a course in Spanish Lee told you about that you can access today, right now, and hear these contents in more depth. It's the same content I teach in MIT, but in Spanish. You can get this book or the original in English, this book. And we're trying to figure out the way in which we can make iTeams, or at least parts of iTeams, next semester available for as many of you as you want, so that you can all use the same things we've been teaching to a few MIT students over the last years, but now we are hoping to take it to the entire world. So let's get started. A new language. So the basic idea is that you've been hearing, a lot of us have been hearing for the last 10, 15 years that innovating, actually we always hear innovation and entrepreneurship together, as if those two things were the same or they were even similar. It turns out that they're not. What people praise as the startup fads may be useful in startup realm, but have very little to do with innovation. And actually, if you look at history, you discover that innovation is actually very different from startups. What you see here in this slide is a few of the companies you might recognize for having been very innovative at different times in the last 100 years. Some of those were startups like Tesla or Ford when they started. Some of those were more than 100-year-old when they did the last innovation, like IBM or Monsanto, or even Nintendo. So why is it that we get this confusion? Well, the confusion happens, I believe, for one simple reason, which is that startups have not yet developed mature mechanisms to control their information, and so they are unusually public about what they do, and they only do one thing. Large corporations tend to do many more things. But innovation actually happens across. And so what I want to do, help you do, is disabuse you of a language that's from startups, from a kind of startups that's consumer startups, so we can discuss about a language that can help you move forward. So this is the first part of the provocative series. So here's the legend. The legend goes that as far as innovation goes, you have to commit to an idea for a product from the outset before any evidence can tarnish it. You have to build something minimally viable, whatever that means. You have to validate it, whatever that means. Or pivot, whatever that means. Be more entrepreneurial, do like startups do, think exponentially, think fast, fail fast, disrupt. These are all the keywords that we hear constantly about innovation. So this is a legend. And those of you that follow me on LinkedIn know that I am pretty vocal about this being a legend. This may work for a certain kind of startup, and I'm not denying that. It just has been taken way out of context. And as a result, a lot of people need to agree. If you decide to agree with this legend, you also need to agree with its hidden costs. So what you see in this chart is a table that shows you or compares some of the startups that have been praised for this attitude, agile attitude, and you see other startups that were, in a different attitude or a different world. For instance, Amazon versus Uber. And what you need to agree, or at least understand, is that if you go with the kind of experimentation proposed by this legend, well, you might be up for a bill that's $24 billion, like the case of Uber, and 23 rounds of fundraising in 9 years. What I mean to say is that this method that seems so agile, actually, surprisingly, it's very expensive. So should you do a startups? It depends. Do you have $24 billion for experimenting? If not, we need another way. Especially these days, we need another way. There's one more thing I want to tell you about this, the legend, which is, for the first time in United States history, it turns out that large companies supply more of the jobs than smaller ones. This is important. It's a statistic published by the Wall Street Journal in April 2017. To me, this is important because this is also the period in which we've had more startups every year than ever before. So clearly, this culture of startups and the idea of innovation, though they overlap, they are not just one and the same. And what we're here to talk about is innovation. I don't want to tell you much more about this legend because my job is not to disabuse you of this legend entirely, but mostly to tell you that there are other ways. So if you want to read more about what I think and what I've discovered about this, you can certainly get it in this place. Quartz at Work, this article I'm showing you on the screen. But if not, let me tell you why we have this confusion. I call it product myopia. And if we were in a classroom now, I would have you vote, and I would have you raise your hand or tell me what you think about this. So I would show you the next picture, and I would ask you, what do you think this is? Now, think about it for a second. I know we can't hear each other. Some people tell me this looks like a music box. Some people tell me this looks like a small motor, like a servo motor. Some people said it was something for sewing. I get all kinds of responses. Then some people complain that this is unfair. They're only seeing the picture. They're not seeing how it works. But I tell them that, maybe they would not have understood anyway when this was presented. But then I move on to the next slide, and I would ask the same question from this next slide. And when I show this next slide, in the chat someone says a screw or an X-ray. So when you see the next slide, what do you think it is? Laser? Shuba says laser. That's essentially what I get. In the first slide that I showed you, this one, I get all kinds of things. No one even asks me what I could demonstrate with this. They just get to guess. And it's actually a good idea, guess it. When we see this one, everybody thinks laser. So why is that? And that's the problem. Essentially, that's the big problem we all have, which is that there is 20 years between these two pictures. If you wanted to have invented the laser and used the laser, you would have had to work with the thing on the left, not the thing on the right. And I'm hoping that you're seeing this the same way I am. But so you would have had to work with the thing that's sitting next to a pen, not with one of those fancy pictures where we know how to use the laser already. And what my point is that we hear about innovation in past tense, when it can be easily and conveniently described with just one product. And so every single piece of something that you may have heard about innovation over the last 20 years is always centered with the subject as the product. And the product is the final result, not the beginning. And that's the problem we have. Everybody tries to invent products. They conflate product design with innovation. They conflate entrepreneurship with innovation. They forget that the beginning, what the one thing that defines innovation at the very beginning is uncertainty. And so certainly product is not what's there at the very beginning. That's a very important distinction. We don't have products, we have problems to solve. That's item number one. So the change of language is stop talking about products. Those will come, but the certainty must come from actually solving a problem, not so much from inventing a product. So that's item number one, the language. I promised you I would tell you about the tools and essentially how to start with what you already have. So the thing is, you can start solving problems with whatever it is that you have right now in front of you. And by that, I don't mean just the parts that you may have at home or Legos or whatever. I also mean whatever organization you have today is the kernel of whatever you'll get afterwards, the same parts. In fact, what I want to show you in the next few slides is that this may well be the only way. And what I mean by the only way is that every single organization you care about, or at least a lot of the organizations I've found, actually started that way. So let me show you with an example, the laser we were talking about a second ago. So this is an excerpt from the interview with the inventor of the laser in the 1990s. You can find the video online. It's hard to find, but you can find it. This excerpt mostly says how the inventor of the laser produced the first laser. And it mostly says three things in here that I find quite peculiar. It says, I was able to get a hold of some rubies, just ordered them. The lamp I could buy off a photography catalog, and the rest of it was simple machining. So now pause for a second, because this is mind-blowing. It was mind-blowing to me when I actually discovered this video in the early 2000s. The first laser, was it truly just a side project with parts that were mostly existing? Is that true? Can this be true? Is this an accident? It turns out that the first laser, shockingly, had no part that was new to it. So how general is this? I'm at MIT, I was teaching students how to use technology, and this example kind of seemed to go counter everything we were teaching. That was very upsetting to me, because I didn't know what to make of this. I didn't know how general it was, so what I did was search for more. Could it really be true that innovating is really a matter of repurposing and reusing something that exists for another idea, for another purpose? So I looked, and what I discovered over the years is that it seems to be the norm rather than the exception, that every first project starts out this way, like the laser, with repurposed parts. And then, by the time we are done, we start to create stories, parallel stories about how many billions of research went into that particular research. But the first one tends to be this repurposed part, almost like a side project. I'll show you some examples. So this, you may see, it's one example. It shows a picture of a magazine, Popular Electronics. This is one microcomputer you could buy in the 70s from a kiosk. It's the one that actually two people called Bill Gates and Paul Allen bought. And you probably know the rest of the story. Now, what's important here is that the first thing they did was actually assemble something for another, essentially a kit of parts. So that's one example. This is the first banknote, China, 7th century. It turns out it was a receipt. Someone would actually store your gold for you and would give you a receipt of that gold, and whomever came back with the receipt would actually get the money. So it was a receipt, but it turns out it was also a banknote. So the first banknote was actually something else. That's the 7th century. This was a few years ago. It turns out, if you read the first paper about blockchain and Bitcoin, you'll see that there it is actually described as a technology that combines peer-to-peer sharing, like the one that was in Napster, with encryption. So we have found plenty more uses for blockchain since this first paper was published, but the very beginning of blockchain and Bitcoin is essentially an algorithm on top of peer-to-peer sharing and encryption. So we can go on. First Tesla. This is even before Elon Musk joined the company. So some people in Palo Alto realized that these batteries had gotten just powerful enough to perhaps put a few of them in parallel and in series. And if they had a chassis of a car that was just light enough, perhaps they could actually build an electric car that worked for long enough, a ride. It turns out that a car called Lotus, has an aluminum chassis, which is lighter than steel, that they actually bought and put together with a bunch of batteries like this, and they had an electric car. This is not how Tesla manufactures cars today, but the first Tesla car, according to every source I could find, was this, repurposed. And the last example I'll tell you about that you can read also in the book is one of my favorite, Greenpeace. Greenpeace starts like an amalgam of organizational parts. A billboard, they fleeted a fishing ship, a concert to fundraise, a ham radio, and a group of either visionaries or lunatics, depending on how you think about them, that felt that they could actually go and stop the United States government with all these parts from testing nuclear bombs. You can read the rest of the story in the book, but the idea here is that even this organization, Greenpeace, which is not itself a product organization, can actually be explained as repurposing a bunch of other ideas. And this remains true today. So what you see here, and the friends from Spanish-speaking friends can actually read it. To the rest of you, I'll actually tell you what it is. This is something I found a month ago in LinkedIn. It's just one of many examples you can find today of how this actually works. People rally around the problem. Here you see a company, or the CEO of a company, called, her name is Veronica. She's talking about a product they built in association with another company where they mix their robotics and that other company's UV lighting to try to propose a means to decontaminate areas from COVID. This will or will not work. I don't know that. I mean, the story needs still to unfold. But the basic mechanics are the same. Recombine and repurpose what you already have. So fast forward. I started telling you that later example kind of bugged me for a long time when I first discovered it. Now I'm telling you that, in fact, ever since I first discovered that one, and it's been a few years, nearly everything I've discovered and everything that changed the world started out aiming to solve a problem that mattered, repurposing something that already existed to actually try to make that first problem tangible. And then all this idea about technology and so on, all of those make it in place, but it's not about the product, it's about achieving scale. So the idea I want you to kind of store in your brains going forward is that at the genesis of an innovation, no thing about that innovation is new. And that's actually great news today, because from a pure process standpoint, the only way to move forward today with whatever you have and rescue your businesses and rescue your ideas is to start with what you have and try to figure out what is it that you need to be doing next, as opposed to sit down and wait for the great ideas to come, which is the part of my third question or third topic I told you about. I told you we'll be talking about today. So the third part is, let me just pause because it's really hard to talk to a camera alone. So the third thing I told you about is innovating continually. So I've told you about this new language. It's about solving problems. It's not about products, it's problems. It's about solving those problems that matter. It's about extracting a competitive advantage from solving the problems, not just from selling a specific product or picket fencing technologies. I've told you about starting with what you have and inventing the technologies as you go. I've told you about bringing together parts, whether they be parts that are physical parts or whether they be organizational units that you already have, and trying to figure out how they combine in different ways to produce something that's new. So how do you do that continuously? Well, I'll tell you what you don't do. And I'm sure you've all sat in rooms where something like what I described in this slide was happening. You can imagine this scenario. We need to innovate. Then someone says, let's have a call for ideas. And then people get a lot of ideas. And then the entire task of innovation becomes one of simply sorting ideas and figuring out a good process to sort the ideas and make the best ideas better and rise to the top. And months go in which none of these ideas is developed. Instead, all that happens is an Excel spreadsheet tries to separate some ideas from others. That's the biggest problem for most innovation processes that I've seen and that we help people kind of overcome. The idea is why people think this might actually work is because people believe that ideas can actually be predicted And what I mean by that is that people believe that the moment you see an idea, you'll get that that's actually great and that's an innovation. And that's not how it happens. Actually, innovating is about building, it's not about predicting. So if you can't predict, then there is no point in selecting ideas or tallying ideas or long lists of ideas or Excel spreadsheets to separate ideas, because you can't meaningfully predict whether they will work or not. It's pointless. It's a huge waste of time. People spend an enormous amount of time tallying ideas, and the ideas simply don't evolve. Ideas don't walk on their own. They just don't grow on their own. And predicting impact is not the same thing as actually having it or doing it. It's actually worse. At the outset, these best ideas actually look like horrible ideas, every single one of them. And I'll show you an example about that in a second. So the key point here is that to survive any of these ideas that are best described as hunches actually need an organization. And your job as a small entrepreneur, or as an existing small business owner, or even as a large corporation, is to get your organization built out of the parts of the previous one, which means you need to figure out how is it that you reorganize your organization, you recombine pieces, you use pieces that you already have in a slightly different way so you can serve a new market, a new product, or a new problem. In fact, the only worthy attribute of ideas is that they can evolve, often, hopefully, beyond recognition, if only you allow them. Indeed, these ideas start out looking preposterous. I'm going to show you one example. It's one of my favorites for two reasons. First, because you can actually find it yourselves, and I'll show you how. And you can get the story, not just from me, but also because it really shows how strange ideas start out and what happens afterwards. So you may have heard of a company called Mars Oasis. It was a not-for-profit that intended to take a small greenhouse to Mars. The year was 2001. Of course, they needed to go to Mars, so they needed rockets. So they tried to buy Russian rockets. The year was around 2001, 2002. Seeing how they could not buy those rockets, they actually founded a company to build the rockets themselves called SpaceX, 2002. As far as I can tell, this year, the plan was still to take just a small greenhouse to Mars as a prelude to figure out how to conquer Mars. But, that was the plan. Let me pause there for a second to tell you that all of these you can actually get yourself by just simply buying a copy of Ashley Vance's biography of Elon Musk and reading this story. It's just there. And that's why I like it, because it's in the public, right there in front of everybody's eyes. It's not something I had to dig out of the record. In 2012, this SpaceX became the first private company to supply the International Space Station. And in 2020, right in the middle of this pandemic, they became the first private company to supply, to take astronauts to the International Space Station. So, back to my point, interesting ideas start out looking preposterous. And the only way to protect yourself from judging them too soon is to have principles to figure out how to repurpose and reuse those ideas or those concepts so that you empower the exploration of an idea. So there is a couple of principles that can help you do that. The first one is you need to diversify. What I'm getting at is the kind of principles that we use to build out those innovative factories I was telling you about in a sec, at the beginning of this presentation. The first one is diversification, which is that in the face of maximum uncertainty, diversification is the only rational choice. This is not a principle I made up. This comes from finance. And what this means is if you are at the stage I was describing at the beginning of this presentation, like when I was talking about the laser, where you don't know anything about what that laser might be useful for, or even if it will be useful, you are in one of the situations of maximum uncertainty, and whatever you do needs to help you move forward without cornering you into some bad product idea. So you need to diversify. Whatever you know needs to help multiple products, not just one. The second principle is that of economies of scale. And this one, you need to tread carefully because almost everybody uses almost these words, but not quite the same subject in the sentence. So this is problem-solving wisdom. It's been known since the 40s. There are books on this. And the idea is that in order to solve a problem, and let me pause there and say a problem that no one else has solved before, not one that you're pretend playing solving, but one that no one else has solved before. You need to imagine that the problem itself is solved and then walk backwards from that state of problem solved. Now, what people do and do wrong is people try to imagine a solution and then try to prototype that solution. But that's not a solution. That's just at best a guess, right? You're calling it a solution doesn't make it anymore a solution. So you imagine the problem solved and then work backwards. And then you need to work and assess whatever solution we'll need and build that. Again, this helps you build economies of scale and de-risk. So it's two principles, diversification and de-risking. The way I hope you remember that is keeping this sentence in your head, which is that risk has nothing to do with how preposterous a problem you focused, like Mars Oasis, but with how much you've let your idea charm you into not learning anything at all. So as I try to close, I want to give you the last glimpse as to about what I'm working on right now, and also about how we set up these as a continuous process and how we've done it in the past. So early on in the presentation, I showed you this slide in which I showed you the fact sheet of iTeams, how we've done this worldwide, and how we've set up innovating factories over 30 times. So how do we do it? What's the production method? So that's what you see in here. We start by exploring ideas. What we do is we imagine this huge space of opportunity that's unconquered. No one has even charted it. And we try to figure out ways in which we could conquer that space. We try to imagine 2, 3, 4, 5 different ways in which we could build organizations that solve problems in that space. And then we try to figure out how to kill it. And that's what we do in second step. We don't just go and choose one and hope for the best. We just literally assume that we're wrong and that whatever we thought was a solution or a set of solutions to that particular problem won't work. And we build a company just to prove that we're wrong. Or at least we plan a company to prove that we're wrong. And then we hope to fail at that. We hope to fail at proving that the company is a bad idea. Those double negatives that scientists love, I love them, tend to be confusing, but follow this idea for a second. If we try as hard as we might to prove that the idea will not work, and we fail at that, then that's the best evidence you have that the idea might actually work, and it prepares you for what needs to happen next, which is scale this idea up. And that's what we're doing in the third stage. So this is the logic we've been following over the last 20 years to help people create these companies, to create them from within MIT or to create them outside of MIT in venture capital and academia. And that's what I'm sharing with you today. It's a way to build a de-risk organization that does not fail in any way that's predictable. When you compare this way of thinking with how people typically think, and that's my last content slide, you see the top and the bottom. The top shows you what I've just told you about, which is this process by which you can actually produce and de-risk ideas and create companies that are robust along the process, and even a way in which you could recycle or repurpose whatever does not work along the way. The bottom is how people think in the venture investment world. It's not bad. There's not a good way and a bad way. It's just we achieve different things. The bottom part of this slide shows you a process by which people try to get to the right idea, move forward, and then make it all a fundraising game until you get to whatever, Series F or something. The top tells you about an end-to-end management process where you try to set up a practice that you learn from continuously. It's two different things. It's two different tasks. But it brings me back to my very beginning. I've been telling you about innovating as a practice you can do yourself as an entrepreneur or as a business person, or you choose it. An artist, an NP, an NGO, whatever you want to do. Innovating and being an entrepreneur are two different things. Sometimes entrepreneurs innovate. More often than not, they don't. It's not a prerequisite. Acting like an entrepreneur doesn't get you to innovate any better or any faster. And the logic, which is what I'm hoping to convey to you today with these slides, is so different that it's worth pausing and saying, what is it that you wanted to do? Innovating or entrepreneuring, if you want to call it that way. My last comment to you is what I tried to show you today is that I want to give you a new language to think about innovating. I wanted to tell you about how you get to start with what you have. And I want to tell you about how to do it continually, because I believe that now more than ever, we need at least clear, straightforward ways to think about what it means to innovate so that we can move forward in whichever direction you guys want to, and at least not get confused by wasting very precious resources doing the wrong thing. So that was the idea, all I have for you today. Just a few more reminders that if you liked what you saw here today, you can get it as a book, in English, the original, in Spanish. I will tell you more about how we make items more accessible to everybody and have videos and so on over the next few months. So follow me on LinkedIn or contact me on LinkedIn, or you can get the course in Spanish right now. What's important for me that you know is that we've done an enormous amount of effort to make this insanely accessible so that you get to choose whether to use it or not, but at least it's not an expensive waste of your time or resources, which I consider to be very precious. So with that, this is my contact information to get a hold of me in email, Twitter, LinkedIn, or whatever you want. And I'll just give it back to Lee. Thank
Thank
you
you,
very much.
Luis. This was really wonderful, and we very much appreciate it. One of the things, though, that I'm thinking about was one of your first comments, and something that I've seen in Latin America, and it seems to be the case that innovation has changed drastically. Most South American countries, delivery really didn't work. And since COVID happened in the last few months, everybody can stay in their homes because of the lockdown and get everything and anything. So I think what you're talking about, how it's not really a change in innovation, right? It's always there. It's always been there. And nothing new has happened. They just got better at doing it. So one of the questions and a lead to that is how do you define technology for those who are non-technical, and how would you make this happen without tech chops?
I love that question. I hardly ever get asked that question, but I actually love that because technology is not what everybody thinks it is. So people think technology is Facebook or the latest web app or something. But the definition of technology that got the T in MIT is rather different. It's a combination of different things that helps us, humans, reach further. So the moment you combine, and I guess the best example of that is the prehistoric axe. You may not think of it as technology today, but back in the day, it was a stick and a stone put together that helps us achieve further. So with that definition of technology, essentially anything you do that combines two things for a different purpose gets you a technology. And the more you refine it, the more it helps you to go further scale. That should mean that even if you don't have the technology chops, doesn't matter, right? It kind of comes with your species. That's that.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. So the next question is from Yvonne. Given that most of this is based on solving a problem that matters, what are the effective ways of identifying that a problem matters versus simply perceived problems? And I think it's important in the context of Latin America, where a lot of times the innovations are copycats of what's going on in the US, right? You take a US idea, you bring it to Latin America, and then they say, oh, wow, we're innovating. Is that really innovating? How do you deal with that?
So, that's a great question too. I try not to be judgmental. I think that if you're bringing something that did not exist where you live, even if it existed someplace else before, and that's helping the lives of people near you, that actually is having an impact, and it's the kind of impact you expect from innovation. Whether you choose to call it innovation or not, it doesn't matter. It's not, it really is in the eye of the beholder. If it's helping your community, it's an innovation, even if it had already been invented elsewhere. Having said that, the first part of your question was how do you sort of, if I can rephrase it, how do you know that a problem matters? And the answer is you don't. I actually mean what I said about maximum uncertainty. At first, all you have is what I would call a hunch. Now, that hunch is mostly a perception that there is a problem worth solving. As you get down the road of making it tangible, the problem itself is going to change. Just like in the case of Elon Musk's Mars Oasis, the problem itself changes as you go, but it's so subtle a change, you don't realize it. So it's the precise opposite thing of what people think. It's not like you wake up one morning and say, oh, I'm going to pivot. It's the precise opposite idea. You slowly make it tangible, and as you make it tangible, you realize the problem was a different one. And you may as well discover that the problem you thought you were going to solve doesn't matter. Doesn't matter to you. This is not to say that it may not matter to other people, but if it doesn't matter to you, then you shouldn't do it. Just do something that matters to you. This is why my obsession with repurposing and recycling, and some of the things that you may have seen a comment about something called the Society of Thinkers in my slide, is so important. As soon as you've made something that to you feels like it's progress in a problem, but then you discover that that problem is not worth your time, there should be a way for you to share whatever you are so that others can pick it up where you left it. And that's a bit like, I believe it's going to become more and more important for us to think that way, sharing more about our thinking about problems and what we've done going solving as we walk through this pandemic.
Perfect. So Luis, there was a question, general, is We usually share all of our presentations after on our website. Jacqueline can provide you with the link. Would you be open, Luis, to also sharing the PowerPoint?
Yeah, sure. I'll create handouts that it's easy to download because this PowerPoint is ginormous in terms of
So,
megabytes.
so Ariel, you'll have both the video of the recorded session and the PowerPoint. A question from Eduardo, and I think this is about your question or points about repurposing, and I would see his question in larger repurposing. Why do big companies with some art, people, and resources disappear when an innovation imposes new paradigms? And I'm thinking of that in this idea of repurposing. Why are big companies unable to repurpose? How come they can't take that laser example, that all the parts that they have, and make it profitable in another manner?
Also, great question. You know, devil is in the details here. Big companies don't disappear, not all of them. The ones that stay, stay. You know, you have a few examples I showed you earlier. Monsanto, Nintendo. So Monsanto, Nintendo, IBM, Apple. You know, Apple is rather old these days, right? It's certainly not a startup anymore, and they stick around. So why do some companies stay and some don't? Or why do some companies survive and some don't? And I guess people often try to look at this from the perspective of an innovation that disrupts them, and then that's how we got all these keywords that make no sense to me, because they sort of describe a slightly different reality. So let me tell you, like, how Christensen explained this when he first wrote his book, at least the way I understand it. Christensen said that oftentimes when companies disappear, they get replaced by other companies that when they started out were not as good as the original company. And the reason for that is that somehow the company that was worse but somehow survived or took over the incumbent had a longer ways to go. That's the way I explained to myself. Whereas the company that was kind of replaced simply stopped looking for repurposing and recombining what they had, or they assumed that they owned the market and they owned the product and they owned the users. And then they discovered they actually didn't, because as far as you and I know, I am as free to choose whichever company I want as I am, right? So there's a confusion that's due to how we speak about these companies and what the subject of the sentences is and how we kind of describe it. So when people talk about their market or their customers, they're making a confusion, right? These companies are actually serving some particular problem. If they stop looking what the problem is, they will be replaced by someone that does. But this is not to say that every company that tries to replace a big company actually succeeds. If you want to do a maximal statement, you should make the statement in reverse, which is most startups die, period. That's the one statistic truth, is that most startups die. So if at all, big companies could rather stay for longer.
So thinking on these big companies and going, so there's a question is, are large corporations incapable of innovating? And what's driving such constraint? If not, what do successful corporations do to innovate?
Great question. So we didn't have enough time for me to go into all those details, but I try to answer some of those in the book and in other materials online. The basic observation I've been able to see from companies that actually, big companies that innovate, is that they seem to have some process for open-ended exploration. Now you can call that research, you can call that an M&A function. So when I think of 3M, I think they have an excellent M&A function, and they are very intently trying to recombine things. They even have something they call the periodic table of 3M. When I think of IBM, I think they have a huge research arm that allows them to have open-ended exploration. So that's one item. They have this permission, they give themselves permission to have open-ended exploration of problems to see what happens. The second thing is that they have some mechanism to discuss how to take ideas to scale. That's different from how most companies try to do it. So most companies try to figure out whether an idea is good before they consider whether they should put money in it. Whereas in reality, no one can predict whether an idea is good or not. So what they should truly do, and what these companies seem to do, is they have a process by which they can, I don't want to use the word experiment because it gets confused or thrown around too much these days, but they have a means to try out the ideas and figure out whether the idea they have in mind will actually scale up or not. So those are two. There is about a list of 4 I typically give, but the idea is that they have a different mindset about how they think about their markets. They don't assume that their markets are theirs. Rather, they assume that they need to be evolving, and so they have a means to allow themselves to evolve continuously.
Excellent. Thanks, Luis. So this idea of big corporations seems like you're not against the big corporation. You don't think that it's a big corporation and that's it.
There's many things to like or dislike about big corporations, but I think we've actually gone a full pendulum swing about criticizing big corporations and falling in love with startups. And I think that part of my responsibility these days is to disabuse people of that notion. So let me give you a number. 2 years ago, the United States saw the birth of about 730,000 new companies. That's a lot. That's more than in the boom of the .com. And that's every year, by the way. In a year, 730,000 new companies. That same year, 730,000 companies died. About. Now, if you look at the statistics, these are all, I'm quoting from memory, so I may get a couple of numbers wrong, but the orders of magnitude are about right. The other thing that's remarkable is that the average life of these companies is about a year or year and a half. And again, you can see all this in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. What I'm trying to bring up is that this obsession that big companies are doing it wrong and startups are doing it right is not healthy. It's not healthy because innovating is different from those things, right? It's actually about a process where you recombine, and it can be done by a startup, it can be done by a large corporation, but if you start to obsess with either, you kind of miss the point. It's about solving problems, not about how big you are.
So thinking about this being the Latin America office, and a great deal of our audience is from Latin America, there's a question about top 3 trends to invest in LATAM. That's one. And then there's the VC question. That's always a problem down here, right? The problem of getting people to invest. You have family offices. They don't want to take big risks. Things are changing. Do you mind speaking a little bit about trends to invest in LATAM, VC, your general outlook? I know that you've had many Latin American students and they all speak highly of you. So I'm sure you've heard this cry more than once.
Yes, and I've heard it. And it's hard to give general trends about investing in public here without kind of looking like I'm a futurist. So let me think about, there is the obvious things, the obsession with AI, the obsession with new kinds of currencies, and so on. I think that the future is finding new ways to tackle climate change for profit. Now, let me pause and tell you what I mean by that. There's got to be a way for us to solve the climate problem that does not require us losing money. Whoever cracks that, not only are they going to make lots of money, but they're actually going to help the planet a lot. And I think that the trend I would be looking for is increasingly, and this carbon example, or the climate change example is one great example. Increasingly, I'm going to see more and more people, I'm seeing it in my classes, interested in problems that it's not just about the money they make, it's about some good they make, but they want to make both. So the investing trends is do good and do well. So you might see it in climate. The obvious examples is healthcare, because in those, the presumption is that you do good and do well. But the more you can phrase your idea as doing good and doing well, the easier it's going to be to rally people. As far as investors and the idea of VCs, people have such a distorted view of what happens in the United States. First of all, the United States has as many flavors of venture capital as there are cities, and as many cultures as there are areas. So it's not like there is a monolithic vision of venture capital. Venture capital in the West Coast thinks of what they do in a way that's very different from the East Coast. I don't want to criticize anybody. They have what they do, and some work, some don't, right? I believe that venture investors that truly get it and make their funds work have a trend to them, and it's that they typically think about companies in a less speculative way. So the more speculative you are, the higher the risk you introduce, because you're adding no human knowledge to what you're doing. So if you're into AI, for instance, just because it sounds great, you'll end up investing in a data company. You will not get the data, it's not AI, and you lose your money, right? So that's essentially it. So as far as Latin America, I would say that there is Latin America, Europe, and a bunch of other parts in the world have this one notion of what venture capital does that it's not quite correct. So first of all, there was no venture capital the way we understand it today in the United States in the 80s. It was just a few examples, right? And so this is sort of a process for these people, for these cultures to develop. Second, people that are venture capitalists typically in the United States care about the kinds of companies they're actually building. It's not just an investment. It's an investment into a kind set of technologies, into a set of markets, into a set of industries that they really care about, and they really understand the risk process they're in. So it's not just about going to someone because they have money. Rather, you have some other individual that truly understands the domain in which they're actually operating, or at least they think they do, right? And they care about that domain. What I think going forward, as venture capitalists in Latin America, we have an opportunity. I would say it's not they're good or they're bad. I have some friends, and I think they're great. Is that we have an opportunity now, and I think it's a great opportunity in the moment we live in, to rethink what we want those investments to accomplish. So it's not that the venture capital in the United States is perfect today, is that coming out of this crisis, we're going to have a different kind of venture capital. We need to invent a different kind of venture capital. Because the one we've had thus far did okay, but it's not what we needed. Otherwise, we would have been much readier for these kinds of crises. And we have plenty of problems out there, climate change, inequality, you name it. So we clearly need to have a better kind of venture capital going forward everywhere. That applies to Latin America as well as it applies to the United States. And some people are that way.
I really like that message, Luis, because I think oftentimes people here only think about profits and quarterly earning, where you're pretty much saying the paradigm has to change. We really need to make the world a better place, and with that, profits will come. We've done talks on sustainability, and I think that's something that Latin America needs to realize, that it's not only about making money, but you also have to make a better world. So fits well with the MIT slogan also.
Yes.
But, in the few minutes we have, there's a question from Sarah about AI, which you've mentioned, right? Artificial intelligence is under development now. In general, we believe that to innovate, we have to use these new sciences. What do you think about this? Because I think, again, right, there are a lot of hot terms now and catchphrases, AI, machine learning, all of this that's being pumped all around the region. And the question is how do we deal with these new sciences? Where do you think things will be going?
So I have very strong opinions about where we are on AI today. Would give for another entire talk if we want to there. So I'll need to be stopped halfway through my rant.
Maybe next month.
Maybe next month. The basic the top line item is 99% of what you're sold as AI is not AI. It's spycraft. And I'm going to kind of like pause for like a second so that for this to sink in. Whenever you have people looking at data to profile other people, that's spycraft. And you actually don't need very advanced algorithms to do that. The real challenge for AI is to survive this spycraft era, which we happen to live in, and sort of come out the other way, thinking about how is it that we use less data and make smarter algorithms that help us achieve something. Now, you have some of those, right? But it's not the mainstream today. Now, I'm actually happy in part that there is so much of a pickup of AI, because at least you get people that are ready to understand. Enough people have actually realized that data is not enough, or just having more data doesn't make you smarter. So they're starting to look for other alternatives. Everybody's accepting that AI is going to stay. As to what to do next, if you only have, in the minute I have to say anything, I'd say, look at the technology, at the AI proposed. If it's proposing, if whatever they propose implies that they need more and more data to do a good job, it's not AI, it's statistics. And now, by the very definition of a field. And so, if you want to invest in a statistical company, by all means do that, right? But then I'm sure that it would be better if they called it statistics and they did that.
Unfortunately, statistics doesn't sound as sexy as artificial intelligence, huh?
Well, then you can immediately start looking at the actual problem they solve and see whether you care about that problem and ignore the technology. Oh, this is a great way to think about the question, how to deal with these technologies. Forget the technology. Technology is a tool, an instrument we invented to reach further. So think about what the company or the organization or the group that's proposing to do something is trying to do and accomplish, and see whether the technology seems to go in line with that or it goes in the opposite direction, right?
Yeah, that's an excellent way of looking at it. So we're just about at 6 p.m. We have many more questions. So I don't know if you want to take one more question and then we'll close, or we bring you back another month so that we can get the full AI talk. But I want to be mindful of your time and everyone else's. So please let me know. Are you willing to take one more? And then
Throw a couple more questions if you want to. I'm happy to. We started a bit late, so I'm happy to give another 5 minutes to the conversation. And I'm happy to come back next month and do it in Spanish if you want me to.
excellent.
Portuguese, I'm not good at it. I'm sorry.
Portuñol just doesn't cut it.
Doesn't cut it.
So the final question for the evening is, can you please touch upon the common mistakes you see people making in your classes when practicing this method? So what would be the takeaway that you would say to watch people, pitfalls or something to avoid?
So everybody tries to predict the future. Like invariably, everybody comes to me and said, is this the right idea? And then they all try to reduce it to a single product so they can apply the booklet of every other book that's out there. So, the way to see this is, it's remarkable how everybody does the exact same thing. So I teach a class in which I spend an entire month telling my students that if it's truly an innovation, we don't know what the product is just yet. We need to discover that. We need to discover the product. We need to even discover if it's actually a product. Maybe it's an NGO, maybe it's a service, maybe it's nothing, right? Maybe it's for people to stop doing something, right? I don't really know what the answer is. So invariably, every student will try to do the following. Will try to make up a product, pretend play they didn't, and then tell me this is the product. And then what I will have to do is unwrap their product and say, you made this enormous guess so that you could think about everything else. The reason why they do that, and it took me a long while to discover this, is every book written since the year 1999 assumes that you have a product idea and starts from there. So that's the problem. So I wrote one in which you don't assume that, right? I'm the only one. So there's only one book that doesn't assume that. And I wrote it because I realized I needed to do it, because there was no book I could use in class that did not have that embedded assumption. And a way to protect yourself from that is to look at the book and see what's the subject of the sentences you are actually trying to use, and how many of those imply that you're starting from a product. That's the one mistake everybody makes, is to try to rush to a product so they can apply the other booklets. The answer is read something from before the 1999, take my book, or ignore the word product, one of the three, right?
Excellent. So everybody, if you have to do something, go buy Luis's book, take his online class if you speak Spanish. But I think most important, let's hope that the future is bright and that things get better for the world, for everybody, and that you all stay safe. So Luis, thank you very much for your time. Hopefully you'll be back later on. Jacqueline, thank you for setting this up, and thank you all for being here tonight. We very much appreciate it. I'll leave the final word for Luis, but from Lee, from the Latin America office, from Santiago, it's been great having you, and this has been really insightful.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lee, Jacqueline, and everybody for being here, and let's make it again sometime soon. Right.
Excellent. Good night, everyone. Thank you very much. Be well.
Bye.
Bye.